Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invite today to Joe and all the SciScreen people for asking me to come along. Might be a bit unorthodox, but I'm going to give the majority of my discussion after the film tonight, because Gattaca is a film that has been quite divisive, and people have very definite views and opinions on the scientific and the ethical issues contained in the film, and I don't want to impose my opinions on people here. So I'd quite like the second part of the discussion this evening to be more of an open forum and to hear people's opinions and what people think. So I'm just going to briefly give a few things to think about while we watch the film and then come back to afterwards. Just a quick background on who I am. I did an undergraduate degree at the University of Nottingham in genetics. I stayed on to do a PhD in stem cell research. Obviously this is a very ethically sensitive area. Happily my stem cells were from human adult bone marrow, so I could get around the whole embryonic issues, which made things slightly more easy to deal with, although that didn't necessarily stop all the protesters that regularly invaded our labs. They didn't necessarily bother about the small facts like that. I then moved into a cancer genetics laboratory, studying endometrial cancers, infertility, and now I've stepped out of the lab and I'm working in the Applied Health Genetics Research Group here at Plymouth. I'm currently working on a project looking at the return of unexpected genetic results from clinical research tests, whether patients should be informed of these results, who should tell them, how long the responsibilities last on the part of the researcher or the clinician. And I'll come back to that a bit more later. So moving on to Gattaca. Gattaca was released in 1997. Now this was midway through the Human Genome Project. This was a very exciting time for science and genetics in particular, and there was a lot of fanfare and a buzz around the Human Genome Project. And a lot of people spoke very enthusiastically about what science was on the verge of unlocking, and kind of genetics was standing on the shoulder of giants and could unlock the secrets of the genetic code. And there were many people that suggested this may well herald the cure for all known diseases, and it would just be a case of interpreting the genome. We found out every cause for every disease and get making on the cures for each one. Now, this was more of a media perception and a public perception rather than necessarily a genetic scientist perception of things. It was always going to be more complicated than that, and here we are 10 years after the publication of the Human Genome Project with lots of information and lots of progress made, but we've yet to have the medical breakthroughs that certainly some suggested might be coming our way. Now, with all the fanfare came the associated worries and fears about what this sort of information could lead to on a negative side. So a lot of people worried about ideas like eugenics and designer babies. There were lots of Nazi imagery put up around the designer babies and creation of a master race, and these are all issues that I want people to just have in their mind when we're watching the film. Also hand in hand with that was the science versus religion discussions, and hand in hand the fate versus genetic determinism. And it was always nice for a media point of view to put this into a kind of one against the other dichotomous sort of situation where it had to be either science or religion, and obviously a lot of people don't believe that necessarily needs to be the case. So the three main issues I want to consider while we're watching the film is what technologies in Gattaca in the film already exist or very similar to the film exist already, and what don't. And I'll be asking people to come up with any suggestions from the film as what they think already occurs or definitely doesn't. Also, is it even possible to achieve genetic perfection? This is kind of the setting for the film is a utopian, genetically perfect society, and without spoiling things, I'll let people judge whether that's even possible to achieve that genetic perfection. And then following on from that naturally is that if it is possible, should we even consider it? Because as with a lot of things, it's not necessarily the science that should hold us back, but the morality and the ethics as to whether we should even do it in the first place. Now, as I said, I'm not an ethicist, I am a scientist, so I will largely cover the scientific facts and fallacies afterwards, and then I'd like to introduce the ethical side of things and then kind of open the floor for people to give their opinions, because I don't profess to have the answers on some of the large questions that a film like Gattaca just throw up for us. So I think now if we just go to the film, and then I'll be back after to talk in a bit more depth. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the film. I certainly did. Okay, so the three main issues I picked up were: can embryos be selected before birth based on their genetic makeup? Can DNA be extracted from urine and used for identification purposes? And can a heel prick test be used on a baby and be used to predict future health issues and potentially time of death and cause of death? So we'll address these one by one. So can embryos be selected before birth based on the genetic makeup? Now the simple answer to this is yes, they can. We currently have a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is used for serious inherited disorders such as cystic fibrosis and Huntington's. Now this is a modified IVF process, so it's an in vitro fertilization process, but it differs very importantly from the process depicted in the film. So in the current process, we can see here, the sperm and the egg are mixed together and fertilized to create a number of different embryos. And at the 8th cell embryonic stage, a small hole is made in the covering of the egg in the zona pellucida, and one cell of the 8 is removed. Now this one cell is then has the DNA extracted and is tested for the condition of interest, and based on whether the egg has the mutation, will decide whether the egg gets reimplanted into the mother. Now the way this differs from Gattaca is that this purely excludes non-suitable eggs, whereas the Gattaca process was a screening but also could choose and alter the sequences and make them the best possible sequence and pick and choose genes. This is merely a screening tool rather than altering the outcome. But it is possible, and it's obviously quite a relatively new and fairly controversial technique because, as I say, it's used for very serious inherited diseases, but the proof of the concept there, it could be used for any manner of different things to identify and choose whether to carry on with the implantation. So it is open to abuse, potentially. So next, can DNA be extracted from urine and used for identification purposes? Again, yes, well, most of the time. The urine itself does not contain genomic DNA. However, urine almost always contains cells, and those cells can have the DNA extracted from them. And this is almost always epithelial cells. Where they depict in the film urinating into a pond, take a very small sample to analyse, that obviously increases the chances you're not going to get any cells. So the way they do it in the film, there's probably a 30% chance that they might not actually pick up on any cells, and therefore they wouldn't get a DNA profile. I should mention that there are non-cellular DNAs contained within urine, but these are small fragments and wouldn't be enough to do a DNA fingerprint to identify someone. Usually come from the bladder, although in healthy people there's not so many. It's far easier to do this technique in women than in men, and it's suggested that in the women you have the bladder epithelial cells and also some vaginal epithelial cells added in, and that increases the number of cells available to extract DNA from. Can a heel prick test be used on a baby to predict future health issues? Again, yes, depending on the condition. Now, this obviously depends on the condition having a high genetic causality. And it also depends on the penetrance of the mutation that we're looking at. So, for instance, the penetrance is what we say with the percentage of people who inherit a mutation who then go on to get the disease. So, for something like Huntington's disease, the penetrance is 100%. So every person that inherits a mutation will go on to get the disease. And so this could be tested for from a heel prick at birth, and you could immediately know that that baby would at some point in their life get Huntington's disease. And diseases like Huntington's with 100% penetrance are very much not the norm. And there's a whole range from 100% down to 1 or 2 or fractions of percent penetrance. I mean, BRCA mutations for breast cancer around BRCA1, BRCA2 around 80% penetrance. Using the similar kinds of technology, there are a number of companies out there now that will, for a certain amount of money, allow you to spit in a cup, and then they will analyse your DNA and test you for 200 to 300 common diseases. And then they'll give you your likelihood and your percentage chance of acquiring those diseases and compare it to the average population risk. This is not something I suggest. A lot of these associations are based on fairly weak evidence. They're not very well repeated, and some of the areas they look to test on might not necessarily be the most diagnostic areas. And even taking all that into account, the vast majority of people that had it have done and found that they're getting maybe a 10% or 5% increased risk of certain diseases being the biggest result they get on the test. And then what do you do with that information? So you've got a 5% increased chance of getting some kind of heart disease. Kind of big deal. What are you going to do, sort of thing. But it also leads to a lot of confusion, because the average person dealing with genetic results struggles to interpret them, and there's not a lot of after-test care provided by these companies. They take your money, they're happy to give you the results, and then they let you go off and interpret it. Now, the problem comes when you tell somebody they've got a 10% increased risk of, say, a certain type of cancer. What tends to happen is that they hear that they've got a 10% chance of cancer. And this might mean they may have had a 1 in a million chance that's now 1 in 100,000 or something along that order, but that's not what they hear, and then you get trouble with people kind of condemning themselves to these illnesses that they're probably never going to actually get, and that can have some serious psychological effects. So I think technologically we're not really at the stage where we should be delving into these sorts of things. There are imminently and just about ready now companies that will sell you your entire genome as a sequence, and that's even worse, to be honest, because suddenly you're going to be presented with 3 billion nucleotide sequence and expected to somehow do something with that. So moving on to the whole genome sequencing, and I picked up on this because it was done firing on the hair in the film. Now, the hair wouldn't contain any DNA unless it still had the follicle attached. So if the hair was pulled out, likely to have the follicle attached, and the hair follicle is a very rich source of DNA. Hair itself is not. So without the follicle, no. With the follicle, yes, it is possible. Again, there's probably better samples to use, but they did introduce at the beginning of the film that they could take surreptitious sampling from a door handle or a shake of a hand or other such things, kind of introducing the fact that you could get good cellular samples very easily, and then throughout the film used a couple of difficult ways, like urine and hair, as an example of what they use for testing, which seemed a little strange to me. There's now investigations based on abortions based on sex have been found potentially in the NHS. So that's illegal currently, but it seems that it might be happening in some areas, and gender is being used as a reason to abort a fetus, which obviously is well against what our current acceptable norms are. But going into the future, these sorts of issues are going to crop up all the time as technology increases, and inevitably legislation takes many years to catch up with where technology is. So it's kind of down to individuals then to kind of impart your own morality and ethical standards on this technology, and it's down to external groups to keep the mad scientists, if you like, in check. Discussing the issues surrounding unexpected test results from genetic testing. So this is where you're going for a test for a disease and they accidentally find out that you've got another one, or something similar, or you might be likely to get another one. And there aren't really any hard and fast guidelines on whether you should be told about this. And we're trying to get people's views on this, on whether people should be told, depending on what condition it is, how serious it is, how likely it is to affect them, whether there's a cure, whether...
An athlete's sperm,
yeah, sure.
And with the idea that the child that may come out will have some of the characteristics of the donor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're already kind of along that path. And just as an aside on that, I think the largest sperm bank stopped taking ginger hair donations a couple of months ago, which I was highly offended at. But yeah, we're kind of, that's crept in. It is acceptable to have a catalogue of pictures and attributes of the donated sperm that you can kind of have a read through and decide which you want to take your chances with. Obviously, there's no guarantee that the actual individual sperm that fertilises the egg is going to necessarily be a good one, but yeah, and this is the problem with kind of legislation catching up with technology. Things are happening, people are making these decisions, and it's kind of not being questioned. It's out there and it's happening. It is worrying.
I kind of thought, like, naturally we did that anyway by choosing our mates. We're choosing somebody who's athletic or intelligent or has got...
Spectrum, isn't it? Because obviously, yeah, that is what you're doing, whether it's on a conscious or a subconscious level. You are choosing who your most desirable mate is.
That presupposes that the end user understands what genetically modified means.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean that, your tomatoes are going to crawl out of your fridge and try and kill you immediately.
The Frankenstein food,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is why kind of, well, pretty much all the pharmaceutical companies just gave up with the UK, because the media backlash before it even happened was so wide-ranging and terrible that you would never convince anyone to eat it, because that tomato was almost certainly going to kill them. So they just gave up and went back to America, where kind of no one really cared what they were eating as long as they were eating, sort of thing. Which is fine. But going back to your point on attributing knowledge to people that don't necessarily have it, this is one of the biggest dangers with the direct-to-consumer genetic testing. It's done over the internet. There's no need for a doctor to be involved. They send you a tube in the post, you spit in it, send it back in the post, and then they send you your results.